and she was my closest companion. So when she was forced to leave us, that was my first heartbreak. Another law was, another Nuremberg law, that no non-Jew was allowed to shop in a Jewish store, thank you very much, in a Jewish store. And I remember being curled up on the windowsill in front of our large display window, watching two members of the Nazi party, each with a rifle slung over his shoulders, marching back and forth in front of our door, making sure that nobody entered our store. Yeah. But the most traumatic to me was the Nuremberg law passed that no Jewish child could continue attending public school. I, with my friends, had gone together to kindergarten, and I have pictures actually of our kindergarten class, and then we went to first grade. We had a small group of friends where every day we would walk to school together. After class, we would meet in the schoolyard and walk home together. Then we'd change our clothes and we'd go out and we'd play together. That was my daily routine. One day, while I was in first grade, after class, the teacher called me to her desk, and in a no-nonsense voice, she said, "You are not to continue to come to class." Now, this isn't because I couldn't handle the work, or because I didn't behave, but only because I was Jewish. I was devastated. I went out to the schoolyard, and my former friends had already left. And the only ones left in the schoolyard were just a few little Nazi boys who walked behind me, taunting me all the way home, with one exception. I had a very best friend. Her name was Marianne. Marianne and I played together since we could walk. I closed my eyes, I could still see her house. I had to cross a small street, walk just a few steps, up a flight, 3-story apartment. She lived on the 3rd floor. Knock on the door and ask her to come out to play. She was the only one of my friends that stayed and waited for me. And she walked me home that same day, trying to comfort me. I never saw her after that, and it honestly took me years to get the courage to ask my mother, what happened to Marianne? Why did she also stop playing with me? And my mother told me that same night, when her dad came home, he worked for the German railroad. I think he was a conductor, and discovered that his daughter had actually tried to comfort a Jewish child, me. He took off his belt and he beat her and made her promise never to play with me again. And I never saw her after that. After that, I had a very lonely existence. The next big happening in the German Jewish community was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, which was November 9th and 10th, 1938. Have some of you heard of Kristallnacht? Good, that's more common. That night, we Jews lost all of our civil rights and our civil liberties. There wasn't a Jew after Kristallnacht that wasn't anxiously waiting to get out of Germany. At the same time, I want to add, there wasn't a German in all of Germany who did not know what was happening to us Jews. It was impossible not to know. That one night, 400 synagogues were burned to the ground. Old Jewish men in their 80s, in their 90s, were actually dragged from their beds, dumped into lorries and taken to concentration camps. In Mannheim, there was, which is the northern part of Germany, there was a hospital for chronically ill Jewish children. The mob outside of that hospital was so unruly that the doctors and nurses locked the doors and barricaded them. And even with that, somehow, the mob managed to open one of the doors. They went in the hospital, began beating up doctors and nurses. Many weren't even Jewish. They actually took children out of their wheelchairs and threw them into the streets. The mob had turned from that into savages. But I want to give you a clearer picture by just focusing very briefly on one family, which was my aunt and uncle, my mother's sister, her husband, and they had a little baby boy. My uncle told me that night, and they lived in Koblenz, which again is in the northern part of Germany, in a beautiful apartment actually, where the Rhine River was, jumped out for breakfast, and you could see the Rhine River flowing by. Anyway, that afternoon, my uncle told me he had just returned from a business trip with a colleague. He had parked his car, and he was on his way to the front door to go into his home, when he was grabbed from behind by two German men. He said they dragged him into a truck where there were other Jewish men in the truck. They took all of them into the police station, and then they put him into a cell, the whole group into one cell, which he said was very inhumane to start with, because they pushed him in, there was barely room to sit. There were no toilet facilities. They had nothing to eat or drink. The next morning, they were removed from the cell, put back on the trucks, and this time they were taken to the railroad station. And on the train, they were transported to the Buchenwald concentration camp. Now, he never talked about Buchenwald, but my aunt said he just wasn't the same person afterward that he was before. And in one of his nightmares, he did relate to her when he woke up once many years later, that on his cot where he was put into this room, he was very close to the wall. There was a very small window right in front of him. And if you looked out that window, you saw a large tree. And he said usually there was a Jew hanging from the tree. They labeled it the Jew hanging tree. And one day he turned, when he woke up in the morning, and his very best friend was hanging from that tree. My aunt, in the meantime, was frantically trying to get him out of Buchenwald. And he was lucky, because he had family in Luxembourg. And he was able to get out after a little less than a year of being in Buchenwald. And he did tell me that when the guard accompanied him over the bridge, on the left side, which was the German side, on the far left were his wife, my aunt, and my cousin, who was still a baby at the time. And the guard refused to allow him to go over to say goodbye or anything to them, but turned him to the right, and at the end of the bridge were his family from Luxembourg. And he said the last thing the guard said to me as I was leaving the bridge was, "Don't ever set foot on German soil again, Jew." And he never did. Now, in the meantime, back to Kircheim, my own parents were frantically trying to get out of Germany. And one night, my father got a phone call from an old classmate who had a travel agency. And he told my father that he now had one opening on a ship going to Cuba. Somebody had just passed away, and that's where the opening came from. But my father would have to make up his mind right away, because he had a long list, and he just wanted to know, he wanted to try to help him out. My dad wasn't too anxious to leave, because he wanted my mother and I to accompany him. He didn't want to go alone. But my mother, in her wisdom, insisted that my father take this one opportunity and go. And that fact is what really saved our lives, as you see as my story progresses. I wouldn't be standing here talking to you today if my dad had decided not to go to Cuba when he didn't have that one chance. Before he left, he was told to sell his house. Now, he had some legitimate offers for our property. Unfortunately for us, the head of the Gestapo also liked our property, and he was called to Gestapo headquarters. He was forced to sign the paper. Everything was done very legally in Germany. Forced, yes, but legal, yes. And he was forced to sign the papers giving away the business and the home for a pittance, of course. That, of course, made my mother and I homeless. So we went to Stuttgart, and we lived in what here would be classified as a boarding home. Now, before my father left, he knew that there was another ship in May that was going to go to Cuba. Otherwise, he said nothing could have kept him from staying with us. And indeed, that's what happened. And I have the St. Louis was the name of the ship. Have any of you ever heard of the St. Louis? You have? I don't know if any of you read the book. It's about the St. Louis. The book is called The Voyage of the Dead. My mother and I have a page in the book. And I have a picture here of my mother and I on the ship. Now, back to my story. May 13th, 1939, we boarded the St. Louis in Hamburg, Germany. There were 938 Jews, approximately 400 women, about 200 children, most under the age of 10, including myself. Every passenger had in his possession a legal landing certificate signed by Cuba's Minister of Immigration. That was to accord us the privilege of entering Cuba. And all of us had our passports. I just want to show you. The German government was very clever in trying to separate the Jews from the rest of the Germans. And one of the ways of doing that was a decree was passed that every Jewish man would have a middle name of Israel, and every Jewish woman, hi Sue, would have a middle name of Sarah. Now this is my mother's passport. The J stands for Juden or Jew. And you can see Sarah? All the middle names of every Jew, just in case you're interested. It's my mother and I on the passport. And this is my dad's. And you can see Israel as the middle name, see that? Okay. And again, the J for you. And a picture of my dad. So, now, the voyage, actually, of the St. Louis, which was a luxurious liner, a beautiful ship, was really uneventful for me as a kid. It had 2 big swimming pools, a large one, a little one for me, and a large playroom, and so I played and swam and had a good time. But I clearly remember our day of arrival in Cuba. I was so excited because I was going to be together with my father. My father had always been the most important person in my life. And so being together with him was very, very important to me. I remember early in the morning, we were in the ship's dining room having breakfast with the loudspeaker beckoned us on deck. And as we got up on deck and we looked overboard, there was my dad. He was in a little rowboat which was bobbing back and forth with the waves, and he was standing up and he was waving with a big smile on his face. And of course, I waved back with a big smile on my face. And that was my last happy moment on the ship. Now, I asked my dad, years later, I asked my dad, how'd you get there so fast? And he told me that when he heard that the ship was getting close to harbor, he stood vigil on the shores in Havana throughout the entire night, awaiting our arrival. And the moment that the ship docked, he paid a Cuban to row him as close to our ship as he was legally permitted. So that's how he got to be the first visitor to any of us. Now, after that, every day I would say to my mother, when are we getting off the ship? And every day my mother had the same response, tomorrow. Now I've got to give you a little bit of a background so you know what I'm talking about. What had happened is even though we had those landing permits, the Cuban government refused us entry. Basically, they were trying to get more money out of us, which we didn't have. And there was no country or anyone in the world that cared enough to say, hey, you can't do this. They're legally supposed to enter your country. Nobody gave a hoot. And so there we were stuck on the ship. And the Cuban government wouldn't let us enter, and we was there. Now, what saved us? Well, who was the hero in our story, and I really feel we had one, was the captain, the German captain of the St. Louis. His name was Gustav Schröder. Gustav Schröder was the smallest captain in the German Navy. He was 5'4". He was a young guy, and he was married and had 2 little girls in Germany. And he knew what was happening to German Jews. He knew if we went back to Germany, we would be taken directly to a concentration camp. And therefore, he said that he would never, no matter what the consequences, take us back. What many people are not aware of, or you don't hear much about, is that there were at least 4 or 5 ships behind us. And their captain, we were the first ones to be refused entry into Cuba. The captain of the other ships, who had the same legal landing certificates we had, turned theirs around, and those ships just went right back to Germany, never to be heard from again. Only Gustav Schröder wouldn't. Instead, he began sending cablegrams to the President of the United States of America at that time. Who was that? Shout it out. Surely somebody knows who the president was in 1939. Huh? Who? Yeah, say it. The Democratic Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You're absolutely right. He was the president.
Brownie points.
Yes, you get brownie points for that one. He was the president at that time, yes. And he simply wouldn't even respond. Now, many of the passengers had visas and quota numbers, which would allow entry. Do you know what quota numbers are? Okay, quota numbers are, which we don't use anymore today. In those years, in '39, only a certain amount of people were allowed to come from Germany. 25,000 happened to be the total amount at that time. And that, of course, wasn't only Jews, that was everybody. 25,000, and we were on that quota. We had a very low number, which means 2 months after being in Cuba, we could legally come to America. Ellis Island was still open. We could have been quarantined. There were many possibilities. And in the meantime, Gustav Schröder was getting cablegram after cablegram from the German government, demanding he brings the ship back and us with it. Surrounding our ship were little boats, small boats with correspondents from all over the world. I have at home a newspaper from Switzerland. Our story's on the first page. I know for a fact that right here in Philadelphia, there were papers. There was an Inquirer or a Bulletin, a Record. Our story was on the front page for a whole week. So we were definitely newsworthy. Not that that helped us, but everyone knew what was happening to us. Now, going back to being a kid on the ship, one day, while I was playing on deck, I felt the lurching of the ship. We were beginning to move. So I panicked and I rushed into my mother's cabin, only to see her lying on her cot, crying uncontrollably. So I wandered back up on deck, and there they were, adults, men and women, with tears streaming down their cheeks. And of course, I knew we were leaving my father. And a very powerless feeling to know you're just helpless and don't know what's going to happen next. We passed the Miami coastline so close that every passenger aboard the St. Louis could easily see the shimmering lights of Miami Beach. So close and yet so far. Gustav Schroeder, the captain, sent one final desperate telegram to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pleading with him to allow the 200 children aboard the St. Louis sanctuary in America. But believe it or not, in 1939, in this vast land we call the United States of America, there wasn't room for 200 Jewish children. He just ignored the request. And as we began to circle, we had to leave the Miami coastline because there was a U.S. Coast Guard cutter making sure we got on our way. Only because Gustav Schroeder, again, refused, and by now he was getting very strong cablegrams to bring the ship back or else, and all kinds of threats, but he wouldn't, and he didn't. As he began to circle the Atlantic, he gave a Mr. Trooper, who was a member of the Joint Distribution Committee stationed in France, the opportunity to assist us. And he went to the European countries, and 4 decided they were going to help us. The 4 countries were England, Holland, Belgium, and France. And of course, if you know your history, you know what happened to those countries, meaning Holland, Belgium, and France. And we were also all to be placed in detention camps in the prospective country and cared for financially by the Joint Distribution Committee. Now, the reason this book was written with this title, Voyage of the Damned, is because those that went to Holland, Belgium, and France, many of them, hopefully not all, but many of them were recaptured because they had been placed in these camps. My mother and I went to Holland. There was a total of 181 Jews from the St. Louis that went to Holland. And I still remember getting off in Belgium, Antwerp, and getting off the St. Louis and boarding a smaller ship and gliding along the Dutch coastline. And that was very hilly and steep. And I saw a lot of Dutch people out there, many of them with those funny Dutch hats and the wooden shoes, waving at us, and it really gave me a good feeling. They seemed to be so happy about us being able to come to Holland. We were placed in a detention camp in Rotterdam. It was called Rotterdam West, the camp was. And there my mother was put into what they call an adult compound, and I was put into what was called a children's compound, so we rarely saw each other. Now, the things I remember most about the camp was, A, I was always hungry. I mean, it's not that we didn't get food, it's just we didn't get enough. And 2, I was freezing. And the reason for that was we left Germany in May. So obviously my mother packed summer clothing. Now we were getting towards September, October, November. It was very cold. We were at the coastline in Holland, and the wind came in from the sea. It was really, really cold. We just had the summer clothing. And the third thing was that it truly was a very filthy camp. Those are the 3 things that I recall. And one incident that helped me survive this whole thing was one day in the children's compound, a huge truck came into the center of the compound. It was like a big dirt all around. is the best way to describe it. That's all it was, nothing but dirt, dirt, dirt. It didn't have any paved roads. It stopped in the center there. And all of a sudden, it's like the truck opened up and clothing came out, children's clothing. Truck right onto the ground. I stood there and I saw this, and I saw kids going over, and finally, it dawned on me, hey, if you don't go in there and get yourself some clothing, there sure isn't going to be anyone to tell you to do so. So I jumped in along with the rest of it, and I had my eye on this little blue coat that I had seen that kind of looked like it might fit me. And I grabbed for it, and I was able to get it. And that coat and I had sort of a love affair because I lived in it after that. It kept me warm. I wore it to bed. I wore it during the day. I was never without it. And then I would sort of fantasize about the lucky little girl who had owned the coat prior to me getting it. So in the meantime, getting back to the reality of the situation, my father legally came to America when the quota number was up. And he got off in Miami. And the first thing he did wasn't to look for a job or to get a meal, but to get transportation to Washington, because he knew how important it was to get us out of Holland as quickly as possible. So he spoke to the American Council in Washington, got the proper papers, mailed them to us. And before my mother passed away, I remember rehashing the story with her, because I did want to make sure that I was accurate in everything I was saying. She told me when she got the notice from America that she was now able to leave the camp, all her friends gathered around her from the St. Louis, telling her how lucky she was and how they wished that somebody had helped them. Incidentally, they all had very low quota numbers, such as we did. And if anybody had lent a helping hand in America, they also could have been saved. But our problems weren't yet over. My mother was really apolitical and rarely said anything bad about anybody. But she did say to me once that the American counselor in Rotterdam was the biggest anti-Semite she had ever run into in her life. He wouldn't help her with passage on the ship. There were no more ships leaving Holland at that time. So in desperation, because even though we were able to go, it looked like we were going to be stuck anyway since we couldn't get transportation. In desperation, she went to, they called him the commander of the compound. That means the man in charge of the entire structure that we were in. She spoke to him, and we were lucky again. He happened to be a captain in the Dutch Navy. So he was able to get us passage on a ship leaving Antwerp, Belgium, which is what we did. And there we went on to America. Good stopping point?
If you want, you still have more time. You
Yeah,
have another
might as
20
well.
minutes. But
That's
to
okay.
allow
I'm
for
hoping
questions.
that there'll be a lot of questions. I hope so. Okay, I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions for me.
So everything was happy after you went on leave?
Well, everything was happy is like pushing it. Yeah, I mean, you know, everything is relevant when you think about it, relative. But happy in the sense that we were out of Holland. When my mother told me that we were now going on a ship to America to be with my father, I didn't believe her. Because when we left Germany to go to Cuba, she told me we were going to Cuba to be with my father. That didn't work out. But the survivor kids all have this thing that they don't want to aggravate their parents because they could see the obvious stress that their parents are under. And I saw the obvious stress my mother was under, so I was never fresh. I never said, I don't believe what you're saying. I don't know where the heck we're going, but I don't believe you. I lost all confidence in you. So I just kept all that to myself. But I didn't believe that we were actually going to my father in America until we were there, until we were in New York, and I saw my father with my own eyes. And then I saw all these people rushing, and I said to him, everything is leisurely in Europe. And I said to my dad, what happened? What's wrong? Why? And he laughed and he said, this is America. Everybody rushes around in America. And now I'm rushing around like everybody else. but that was many years ago. So, I mean, it was very difficult. We got here, of course.
How long were you separated from your father? What was the length of time this took?
About half, well, no, actually, 3/4 of a year, something like that.
So how
roughly.
long were you in that camp?
Well, we got there in June, and we left at the very end of November, I think the 29th of November. Long enough.
What did you do in the camp?
I did nothing in the camp, nothing, because I wasn't being supervised. Remember, I was a little girl. I'd been thrown out of school since first grade. By now, I was pretty belligerent. I had a chip on my shoulder. I mean, you know, it is. So now, what happened is, in the camp, they started a school. Some of the passengers of the St. Louis were teachers, and they went to the children's part of the camp. And they said, you can come to the school, and it'll be at such and such a day, at such and such a place. I just never showed up. So which is, of course, to my own, detriment. I didn't realize at the time. I just didn't want to follow authority. I could rebel in this little way, and my mother wasn't there to say anything. So it wasn't, I had nobody. And so I could do what I wanted. Well, when you're 8 years old, you do what you want. Think of amazing things to do. So I just really wasted all of my time there doing nothing. Basically, I had a few friends that I played with. But I can still remember a beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed friend that I had. I was envied her because she was so pretty. I was so plain. And she was so pretty. She was everything I wanted to be. And she was adopted by a Dutchman. She was my best friend. She was adopted. I always wondered what happened to her Dutch Jewish family from the camp because she came alone. See, I had my mother with me. I mean, not with me in the compound, but my mother was there. This child was alone, totally alone. She had lost everybody. She had been taken in the children's transport to Holland. And so she was completely alone. So she was adopted by a family. And I know I missed her. I hope she was okay.
Do you know what happened to the captain of the ship, the German?
Good question. I always wait for that question because I think it's just about the most important question that anybody could really ask because it's so important. Nothing happened to Gustav Schroeder. Absolutely nothing. He brought the ship back to Germany without us, of course. And of course he lost his job. But aside from that, nothing happened to him. The thing is, unfortunately, there were so few Germans that did not join the Nazi Party that those who didn't were just really left alone. And the interesting thing is that during the war, when the German people were suffering because we were bombing them and so forth, it was the people from the St. Louis that put money together to send to him and help him along. And I think he lived a righteous life, but he was never punished. He was never put to prison or anything of that nature. Just sort of left alone. Thanks for asking that.
What kind of life did you have when you got here?
A rough one. I remember shortly after I came here, I was placed in 3rd grade in the Mifflin School in Germantown. And of course I didn't know a word of English. As I said, I was already a rebellious kid. And somehow the kids must have been told about my coming because otherwise, when I got there, in the school year, there was like a bunch of kids sort of around me. I had an adult with me, of course. And they all screaming this one word, hello. I didn't even know what they were saying, so I thought they were saying something derogatory. But nobody bothered interpreting. You would think they would have an adult that knew a little bit of German, so they could, tell me what was going on, but no. The adult spoke to me in English, and I couldn't understand her any more than I could the kids. So I was placed in the 3rd grade, doing nothing. I came home with a report card of S, which was, their S was satisfactory, U was unsatisfactory. And it was astonishing, I got an S for nothing. I mean, I didn't even have to fill out a paper because they understood that I didn't understand. So I just thrust into this class. And during lunchtime, I wandered around outside and had a drink of water. They had those faucets out there. There wasn't any money for lunch money for me. And in those years, they didn't give lunches or anything of that nature, so I just didn't have any lunch. And so it was certainly not a very nice time for me. Eventually, I picked up the language. I guess it's called survival. You know, if you tell the person next to you, can I see your book? You have to be able to say it in English, in order, I mean, it's just a stupid example, but it's just an idea, so I did pick up. But it's not that I had any help or any extra tutoring or anything of that nature. They also put me in they thought they were doing something nice. They put me, believe it or not, in the orchestra, in the band. They gave me a flute. First of all, I said I didn't want to be in the band. I didn't want to play the flute. But they thought they're doing me a favor. They put me, and then there was supposed to be a performance. Now, of course, I can't tell you I was a star to barely play, but I was still in the band. I tried to think of a way, how am I going to get out of this? I knew I couldn't talk to my parents, because they would say, do what you're being told to do. So I hit upon a novel idea. I took the flute to a creek and I threw it. Then I've forgotten this story for so many years. I don't know why it flashed in my mind now. So I came back to school and I told them I had lost school. By the way, I never bothered repeating any of this to my parents. They didn't know about it. Either that I was, I just sort of left that in, for which I was reprimanded. But I didn't care, because I expected to be reprimanded, and I thought I'd put one over on them, because I really didn't want to play in the band. So my own way I did, but it was a stupid thing to do.
Looking back on all the fatalities caused by the death camps and how you were saved, how lucky do you feel to be
I feel I was exceptionally lucky. It's almost like my husband was religious Jewish. Jews would say, my daughter was religious. It's almost as if Hashem had a plan. Because think about it, we actually went, our roots in Germany went back in the 16th century, though my father had found my grandmother's Bible with names of people that had gone to other countries, and we did write to them. Nothing came back in time. And then he got this phone call from this classmate. It wasn't particularly a friend, just a classmate. This person just died. If he hadn't died, I couldn't have called him. My father was not the next person on the list. It's just that we knew him and we wanted to help him. And my mother insisted that he goes. And so we get to Holland, and most of the people, this is what happened to the other people. I usually forget about this part of it, but after I grew up, I wanted to know what happened to my friends. What happened to the rest of the people in the detention camp in Rotterdam. And they went to Westerbork. Now, you might know because Anne Frank went to Westerbork. If you're familiar with any story, it would be the Anne Frank story. She went to Westerbork. And one year, many years later, I went with my husband. I wanted to see Westerbork. Very little had been written about it. It was a huge camp. And I still saw the railroad tracks. What happened, it was not a camp, it was not a death camp. But from there, the trains went to Auschwitz. So I have no doubt that if my father had been in the United States to bring us over, my friends there were family units with father, mother, and children together. So we were separated, but most of them were together. So my fate would have been like theirs. So we were lucky to get out, and that I didn't end up in Westerbork like my friends did. And so again, we were saved. It's sort of strange when you think about it. And even then, when my father sent the papers that now we could leave, and my mother tried to get transportation, and she was told by the American consulate there are no more ships leaving Holland, which was true. And there's nothing I can do. We were stuck here for the duration. Duration would have meant going to Westerbork. She had the sense to speak to the commander, who just happened to be a captain, a little unusual, a captain in the Dutch Navy, and was able to get us. So I would say I was exceedingly lucky, yes. Absolutely not. I didn't have the foggiest idea what was going on. And now my daughter, for example, explains everything to her daughter. I mean, whatever trivia, whatever's going on. Esther's only 6, but she talks. My parents never did that. I didn't even know why I was kicked out of school. I mean, I heard the teacher say because I'm Jewish, but that didn't make sense to me. I didn't see anything wrong with being Jewish. I was always told you're punished, and if you do something bad, you get punished. I hadn't done anything, so I couldn't figure that one out. All of a sudden, nobody used to play with me anymore. And then my father leaves, and nothing was explained to me. I mean, my mother had to tell me that we're leaving Cuba, but the story of it, I guess she thought I was too young. Too young to. Well, when I grew up, when I was in America, I studied the Holocaust on my own. I began to see what happened to my family. I mean, my mother's other sister died in Kircheim, and we lost a lot of family.
How much did the Americans, when you were there, or other people like your parents know about what was going on in the concentration?
At the time we arrived in America, very little. Later we learned, we tried very hard. I had a cousin, she was 17, Hilda. She wanted to be a ballerina. And my father tried very hard to get her to bring her to America. By the time because there was no help from anyone, no help from Jewish organizations, no help from other organizations, no help from anyone. So it was very hard to put the money together that we needed for her affidavit. And by the time they did and send it, they got a letter back from the German government saying she was a paid employee of the German government. They called her a slave laborer. That was her title. And her big position was that she was rolling bandages at the Red Cross. And apparently it wasn't that important because at the end she went to work there with her father. So we knew terrible things were happening, but didn't know to the extent that they were happening. They happened slowly only because the world would allow it. I have always said that if German Jews, we were a small group, would have been saved, the rest would not have happened. East Europe and so on and so forth, to camps and so on. It wasn't until it was very clear to the Germans that by starting death camps, they were not going to be punished for it. And they weren't. The camps were never bombed. You know that if you know anything about the Holocaust. The tracks to the camps were never bombed. So there was a lot of compliance from the rest of the world that permitted this horrible thing to happen. The extent of which we didn't know until after the war. The extent of horror.
Ronnie, in retrospect, what's your feeling on the Roosevelt administration and how they failed to respond? When your father went to the consulate, I'm assuming that he was only able to sponsor his family. He wasn't able to.
No, nobody else.
Nobody else.
No.
But was there any? There was knowledge at the time of what was going on. What do you feel now, in looking back, knowing what you know, about why the administration failed to make any kind of commitment, even to 200 children?
With the following students reporting
It's
from
almost
reception desk,
impossible
Matt
to
Toon,
think
Ronnie
that the
Andrew
government
Young,
would be
and
that
Melissa Murphy, to the
not
front
caring.
receptionist desk.
But
Matt Toon, Ronnie Cupola, Andrew Young, and Melissa Murphy. Thank you.
obviously the State Department has always been very anti-Semitic, as my mother said. The American
Would Matt
Council.
Hammer report to the attendance office, please? Matt Hammer to attendance.
The American Council was the worst, and after all, she had dealt with German councils all her time in Germany. So he was the worst that she had. So it really, it's a hard question to answer because I don't want to be disillusion young people in this room too much. If we're alone, I'd really let you have it. If you know what I mean.
Nobody else here. Just
I feel that the government was fully aware of what was happening and what would be happening to us. And they just had a totally I don't care attitude. But nothing can convince me that 200 children would have made a difference regarding his political life. I mean, I don't even think it would have made a difference if not. By the way, most of the people on the ship were of the higher echelon.
Matthew Hammer, please report to the attendance office. Nat Hammer to attendance.
Most of them were doctors and lawyers and people well-educated, able to help themselves, so they didn't need the assistance of the government. When we came over, there was no assistance. I want to make that explicitly clear. There was no assistance from the federal government for any of us. My father sold Electrolux, which is a vacuum cleaner. He went from door to door as a starter. My mother worked as a seamstress in a dress shop for 50 cents an hour. I didn't go into the story where my aunt and uncle, we met them on the ship, but my aunt worked as a cleaning woman, my uncle worked as an elevator man. And at the end of the week, we rented a home together to save the money. At the end of the week, I still remember them sitting around this big table, and they would pool their money. And then, of course, the money was taken for gas, and electric, and transportation to go to work. And whatever was left over there, that was the money we lived on. So naturally, there was no money for lunches for me. And I went to, if I didn't open my mouth, you would know I was different because I wore German clothes, which were too small for me. I was skinny as a rail. I had an eye infection, which I got in Holland, which hadn't been treated, which was so severe.
Would Emmy Carpenter, Spencer Clayton, and Richard Newman report to the main office? Emmy Carpenter, Spencer Clayton, and Richard Newman report to the main office.
The infection was so severe that when my mother and I would go somewhere, there would actually be strangers coming to my mother and saying, "What's wrong with her eyes?" Like, you know, and that was all very embarrassing to me, and because we didn't have the money for treatment in those years. But we were truly, completely on our own, which is why the German Jewish community formed the Central Club, a club where we would all meet together. And the only money I ever saw, if I have time to finish this final little story, is I walked from my house to the Mifflin School, McKean Avenue, which was about 3/4 of an hour, pretty far. And the only time I saw money was when it rained. Then my mother gave me 10 cents. That's really gave me. That's what the transportation was at that time. The streetcars cost 10 cents. But I, of course, never spent that 10 cents on the streetcar. I mean, it's the only money I had in my hands. I would walk to school, then I would go to a 5 and 10. They had them there where things were really 5 and 10 cents. And I had a big choice between a comic book and paper dolls. And you have no idea. You have no idea what a big decision that was for me. To have that 1 10 cents and only to spend it on one thing, I had to make them really. I mean, when I see my grandchildren now with the money and so I mean that was so. But believe me, those paper dolls or the comic book I treasured because I really understood the value.
Ronnie, just tell me how many people survived in St. Louis out of the 900 that were on the
sorry.
ship? How many people survived?
It's very hard to tell exactly how many. All of those from England, which were about 214, everyone survived.
Okay.
The others, it was a handful here and a handful there. From our camp, I think maybe another 2 or 3 at max. I'm talking about Holland. I don't really know in Belgium and France. There's a few survivors, a few handful, young people that were able to make it out. But the majority, unfortunately, ended out in the same concentration camp that Gustav Schroeder was trying to save us from.
That's why it was called the Voyage of the Damned.
That's why the book was
The
called
people
Voyage.
were given no government
Cared.
who cared enough to take these children, adults, educated people in. And Hitler knew it, Ronnie. In retrospect, historically, Hitler knew it. You were the test case.
He knew it.
You were the test case. They
We-
wanted
we-
to see the
I
Allies.
think we were the go-ahead for the concentration camps.
Yes.
Because my aunt was still in Germany at the time. She went to movies, kilos. And they showed this is wonderful propaganda for the German government. They showed the ship. She saw us in a movie in Germany. Not my mother and I, but she saw the ship. She saw different passengers. And it was very clearly said that here they are. We let them go. And nobody wants to take them, so we're going to take them back. And
And
that was the
there-
beginning of the end. That was.
Ronnie's mother lived till 98? Your mom?
Yes, she did, bless her.
She lived till 98. She just recently passed away.
Yeah.
And
bless her.
led a, you know, and raised a wonderful daughter, as you can say. I'm Ronnie's fan club, as you.